My name is Asha Nelson. I'm a project coordinator at ClimateWest, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar, Climate Preparedness 101. So this is the first in our three-part webinar series, which is a collaboration between the Manitoba government and ClimateWest. This series aims to take you through the climate adaptation journey using free tools and resources developed under the Manitoba Climate Resilience Training program. However, before we get going, I think it's important that we ground ourselves in a land acknowledgement. ClimateWest's work occurs on the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations and covers the territories of Treaty 1 through 8 and 10. Today, I'd like to acknowledge where I live and where the ClimateWest office is based, Treaty 1. This is the traditional ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Inuit, Anishinawag, Dakota, and Dene, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge Treaty 3, specifically the Shoal Lake 40 area, where we get much of our water supply from here in Winnipeg, and the Nelson River, Treaty 5, which supplies 70% of our electricity here in Manitoba. At ClimateWest, we deeply respect the treaties and the Indigenous ways of knowing and being. We are committed to the ongoing work of truth and reconciliation and exploring ways to better respectfully weave these knowledges into our climate adaptation work. Now, we encourage you all to take time to learn about and reflect on the Indigenous lands where you live, work, and play, and consider what actions you can take towards reconciliation. So, if you don't mind, I'd just like to take just a moment for you to share in the chat your name, organization, and what Indigenous lands you're on today. If you don't know, that's okay. We're including a link in the chat to a site called nativeland.ca for you to explore that. So if you don't mind, please add your name, organization, and the Indigenous land that you're on. Great, Treaty 1, nice. So just as you're doing that, I'm going to give a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. So we're going to start with a brief introduction of ClimateWest. That's your regional climate service provider and host of this webinar series. Then I'm going to pass it over to the Manitoba Department of Environment and Climate Change, who's going to dive into climate preparedness and give you some foundational concepts for your climate resilience journey. Finally, we set aside about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So if any questions come to mind during the webinar, please feel free to write them down in the Q&A function there, so instead of the chat. So who is ClimateWest? We are a nonprofit organization that provides free and reliable climate services across the prairie regions of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. We are supported by the provinces of Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and at a federal level by Environment and Climate Change Canada. We're also part of a national network of regional climate service providers that work in partnership with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services to help Canadians better adapt to our changed and changing climate. Our vision, we want to see communities, businesses, governments across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba equipped to thrive in the face of a changing climate due to decisions informed by the best science, expertise, and training that is tailored to meet their needs. As for what we do, we are driven by a shared belief and commitment to collaboration and inclusive decision-making in climate resilience building. On the screen, you'll see some words we often use to describe what we do. For example, we share climate information and resources which are reliable, credible, and regionally relevant. We connect people to resources, and information to action. We make complex ideas accessible and relatable to a variety of audiences. And we can help you find local climate data, understand its implications, and provide guidance on how to better integrate climate data into your decision-making. One example of ClimateWest knowledge products is a snapshot of the changing climate, which you'll see there on the screen. So this is designed to give readers an accurate picture of the past, present, and future climate for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. The publication looks at several major weather and climate hazards specific to the Prairie region and how they are impacting and will continue to impact this area, specifically across the main sectors of our 3 provinces. So connect with us. We have a free help desk, so please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, big or small. If you'd like to access our help desk or simply connect with us, please call or email us. Our contact information is just there on the screen, as you should see. You can also scan the QR code to sign up for our monthly newsletter. You'll see that QR code there, which will give you information about the latest resources, events, and training to help you advance climate resilience in your community. Now, I'd like to pass it over to Elaine Fox and Alex Bourne from the Climate Preparedness and Communications Branch of the Manitoba Department of Environment and Climate Change, Climate Action and Energy Innovation Division. Over to you, Elaine.
And so is my video on? I can't see myself. Yes, I'm there. Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our first webinar of the series of 3. And this one is Basic Concepts, Climate Preparedness 101. My name's Elaine Fox, and you can go to the next slide. And I'm the manager of the Climate Preparedness and Communications branch within the Division of Climate Action and Energy Innovation. And we'll give you a short outline. Next slide, please. So the Manitoba Climate Resiliency Training Program has been going on for a while, but there's a history of how we got there. So we'll go over the progress of those climate adaptation aspects, the objective of our series today, and the climate change basics like climate adaptation and mitigation. What are climate scenarios? How do models fit into this? What are trends and risks that we're looking at in the future? What is net zero? Climate change costs, climate services, and the key takeaways we hope you have from this first webinar. Next slide, please. Oops. I'm looking at it. So we didn't just start yesterday. We actually have been working on climate adaptation as a provincial government since 2009 and 2018, and that was our first induction to it. And many of you might remember the Prairie Regional Adaptation Collaborative. It was focused mainly on elected officials and decision makers in organizations to make them aware of climate adaptation and the impacts that might be coming their way. We then moved after that into 2018-19, building regional adaptation capacity and expertise, the BRACE program. And that was run out of NRCan as well. And it was looking at training for those professions and associations that support decision makers. Because if we've got the decision makers understanding what they need to do, if they can't find any consultants or engineers or that can support them, it becomes very hard to do that adaptation planning. So we continued on when the BRACE program finished, and we did as Manitoba, the Manitoba Climate Resiliency Training. And this is part of it continuing on. In 22 to 24, we focused on vulnerability and risk assessments and the needs that you have. So if you understand your forecast of what's coming your way, you then need to prioritize and look at your vulnerabilities, your risks, and your opportunities. With risk comes opportunity. With change comes opportunity. And then right now and onwards, we're doing adaptation planning. So that's the final. So once you figure out your risk and vulnerability, you're now planning for the future. And how do you work that into your budgets? How do you work that into your planning documents that you own? So we'll move to the next slide. And that's this series itself. So this is the very first one, 101, Preparedness. The second one is how to conduct a vulnerability and risk assessment. The third is climate adaptation planning. So in those other 2, we will most likely go through the documents that we have prepared and the templates to help support you in doing these tasks. Our overall objective is to gain knowledge and skills to integrate climate considerations into your planning, your decision-making, which will help you prepare for hazards and take advantage of opportunities, avoid impacts. Next slide, please. climate adaptation, climate mitigation. There's two worlds to our environment. And there's the mitigation side, which you've most likely heard about most, which is greenhouse gases, reducing emissions, lowering carbon. And we do that through sustainable transportation, buildings, looking at our waste reduction policies, and clean energy. Then there's the adaptation side. Because we didn't do all of that emissions for the first 100 years, we've changed our climate. So we're having to deal with more severe and frequent events. So like wildfires, like floods, changes in seasons so that we have invasive species. And how do we do that? We can protect ourselves. We can take preventative measures to stop, these things from happening to us. Biggest example we have is like the floodway that they did in the 1950s for Winnipeg. It has protected us from events that have occurred since that point in time. There's also a sweet spot between mitigation and adaptation where we kind of meet both. Green infrastructure, one of them would be wetlands. Wetlands not only store water to slow down flooding or store water so that we have more availability for drought, but they store carbon, which reduces greenhouse gases. Education. The more people know, the more people understand, the better equipped they are to deal with situations. Things like supply lines and local foods. We saw the pandemic and how it can disrupt supply lines. Having things more locally reduces the greenhouse gases in transportation, and it also secures and makes certain that regardless of the impact that's happening, whether it's a wildfire or a flood, you have food on your table. So there's those items there. Our next slide, please. So climate adaptation, disaster mitigation, climate preparedness. Are we talking about the same thing? You'll hear on the adaptation side a lot of different words and languages that all mean the same thing. And that's because we're still evolving as an area and different departments look at things differently. Coming from environment, we usually talk about climate adaptation, but our colleagues in EMO always talk about it as disaster mitigation. But a flood is a flood and the dike is the dike. So they are very similar. We're also using preparedness a lot more because I think people identify and they understand how to prepare better than how to adapt. So it's all about being proactive. It's all about building your own resiliency through these items and understanding your forecast and how it's going to impact you and how you can plan and decision make. Next slide, please. Climate versus weather. So weather is really changes by the hour, day, and week. It's short term. It's readily observable. You can walk out your door and kind of figure out what your weather is. Climate is something that is much longer in its observations. It's over a decade, century, or millennia. It's an average calculation of the weather that occurred over those longer periods of time. Most climate observations, the shortest you see is 3 decades, 30 years. But within those systems, between weather, which is immediate, and climate, which is long-term, there's natural variability. And what would make it vary? Those are things like the jet stream, El Nino, La Nina events, or things like a volcanic eruption and it puts a whole bunch of particulates into our atmosphere, or ocean currents can slightly change. There are solar cycles as well that can naturally vary what is happening, and it doesn't go from the past recorded weather. And so in the words of Mark Twain, climate is what we expect, weather is what we get. Next slide, please. So many times what we're dealing with is climate scenarios. Calculating the emissions helps to illustrate the range of potential futures based on varying amounts of greenhouse gases and the projected rates of warming. The system many of you may have seen in past people talk about is RCP, or Representative Concentration Pathways. And it basically was a low one, a medium one, and a high level one. The low was really significant reductions in our activities and negative emission technologies, and to try and keep warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, very stringent. mitigation pathway. 4.5 was kind of the middle of the road. Emissions would peak around 2040, then decline. Moderate increases in temperature, intermediate stabilization of the pathway. We would continue to see frequency and severity of events, weather events, increase. 8.5 was business as usual scenario. High emissions, no significant mitigation, substantial increases in temperature, and we really don't know what the end of that would have been. So, or we do. So what we've done is change that system because it was very limited in what it looked at. And we've moved now over to CMIPs, and CMIP 5, CMIP 6 is what we're using as a version. And that's the coupled model intercomparison project. And that's the last time you'll most likely ever hear that, and everyone will just go CMIP. It's a global effort to improve climate models and understand how our climate is changing. It gives a clearer forecast and stronger predictions. It has a better understanding of how the different parts of the climate systems operate together, like El Nino, like jet stream. It's easier to downscale for local use. So yeah, it's really nice to get a global model that says the prairies are going to be warmer. Well, what does that mean to you in Winnipeg or Boissevain? How do you plan for the prairies are going to be warmer? It's hard. So you really need to downscale that information. One of the other things that MCIP incorporates are social and economic data and policies. So that really does have an impact, not just the weather, but also those economic drivers and the social drivers. Next slide, please. Future forecasts. So how do we know what's going to happen next? Climate models are really an essential tool for climate scientists. These models allow us to reconstruct past climates, simulate the current climate, and evaluate how future climates may be different. What do climate models project? Models usually produce projections of future climates by determining how the climate will react to changes in greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And that's the trapping of heat within our atmosphere that's not radiating out. The more greenhouse gases there are, the more energy remains in the atmosphere and temperatures increase. Accuracy of forecasts improves when you use several climate models. So we don't rely on just one model. We'll take and we'll run multiple models in order an average between them to get a better picture of what's going forward. Next slide, please. How do we know climate models work? Well, it's how we run the data, and climate models are very good at simulating climates of the past and current. So if we take all the weather and we analyze it, is it an accurate representation of the past? Because we know what happened in the past, and we know what's happening to us today. So if those models with the information put into them give us accurate forecasts for those periods, therefore we know that there's a high probability that their projections into the future as we put information into them are valid. And the warming of the last century can only be simulated when we add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So we can take just baseline that we've seen for a millennia, using ice cores, using other methods to identify what was the weather and climate. And we run simulations, and it's only when we add greenhouse gases that we actually get the current or the future. Greenhouse gases, as I'm sure everyone's aware, is attributable to human activity of fossil fuel burning. Global climate models need to be downscaled to a local level to support decision-making, as we identified before. And it's more reliable to have multiple climate models than just a single model. I think right now, Prairie Climate Center is running well over 20 climate models. Okay, global versus Canada's temperature. So the chart you see on the left is the global temperature rise, and you can see that it was a lot of noise in it, but fairly stable as we got to 1950s, and then it's just exponentially moving up the scale. When you look at the chart to the right, you can see Canada's line is the blue line, and it's actually heating up faster than the global temperature is heating up. So on average, Canada is warming twice the rate of the rest of the world. And the trend is even more pronounced in northern Canada. where the warming rate is nearly 3 times the global average. Next slide, please. So what does global warming or warming of our country mean? It actually manifests itself in events such as sea level rise or increased pest and fire activity for wildlife, degrading permafrost, reducing reliability of ice roads, winter roads in Manitoba, increased frequency of droughts or in agriculture, and changes in water level, which for us in Manitoba can really affect our ability to generate energy. Next slide. So as we see, we've got all of them pretty much, other than sea level rise. We actually, because our land is our air, we're actually the water sea level rise is not happening. We're actually having our sea level drop. So we have wind events, which have actually increased our tornado alley. It's widened east and west and moved more north into our province. Winter roads and our infrastructure, we're having to put more of them over land rather than over water bodies. 3 things that we don't talk about is heat stress on people and animals, and what does that do, and how do we have to change some of our patterns of work. Mental health and eco-anxiety is moving forward. If anyone's ever been through a flood or lost their home to a wildfire, it really does have an impact on you. And if you don't know it's going to happen, that creates a lot of anxiety. But as we've talked, with all of these risks and changes, there's also opportunities. We will have a climate that will extend growing seasons. We may be able to grow new products in agriculture here. Recreational seasons will change. We might have our parks open for a much longer period of time, and have tourists coming to us for a larger area, piece of time. I'm losing my words, people, sorry. Next slide, please. A lot of times we're hearing about net zero, and net zero means balancing the amount of greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere with an equivalent removal of offsets of greenhouse gases. A lot of times people think that net zero is no more emissions ever again. No, it's a balance. It's trying to make sure that we have a set aspect. The climate will continue to warm until greenhouse gases are reduced to net zero, at which point the temperature will stabilize. Why is that important? The balance is crucial to prevent the worsening of climate change hazards, such as extreme weather events, rising sea levels, loss of biodiversity, and spread of disease. Net zero establishes a limit to what we need to prepare or adapt or build to as a protective tolerance. It further reduces the extreme of climate hazards and compensation that we need to be paid out. Reaching net zero allows us to build modernized economies in a physically safe communities from climate hazards. Next slide. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Alex Bourne. Alex, if you want to introduce yourself. Thank you.
See my picture. I'm not seeing myself on the camera at the moment. There I am. Great. Good morning. My name is Alexandra Bourne, and I am a Senior Policy Advisor in the Climate Preparedness and Communications branch. And I'm going to talk to you about the second half of this presentation. So then we can move to the next slide, where we're going to talk about the cost of climate change. So this is the financial cost that we're seeing because of climate change. And we look at this with the insured catastrophic losses that we see. The average annual payouts from 1983 to 2000 were 440 million. So steady average payouts. And what we've seen is a very significant increase in our average annual payouts due to catastrophic losses. And as you can see in the graph there, it steadily increases to 2024, which was 8.5 billion, the worst year to date. These costs are just private insurance. It does not include all 3 levels of government costs, such as businesses or individuals. The map at the bottom shows, oh, sorry, we went a bit too fast. The map at the bottom shows that the insured catastrophic losses in 2024 occurred across the country, not just in the prairies, but we are seeing some events in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta as well. So that's been a significant increase in our average annual payments, and all this information is from the Insurance Bureau of Canada. Next slide, please. So just to focus on the cost of climate change in the prairies, ClimateWest has done some studies on this, and what we're finding in Manitoba is the cost projected for 2050 will be $4 billion. And this is, in Manitoba, we have the highest cost for climate change per capita at 2.235. These are significant amounts of economic losses that are attributed to climate change. And I encourage you, if you want to look into more details of these financial numbers, to look at ClimateWest's publication on their website. Next slide, please. So looking at the climate change in Manitoba, what we can look at is the average annual mean temperature within the province with this heat map. We can see that the baseline map from 1976 to 2005, the colors are that we don't have as much red at the bottom, which is the warming of the temperature. And we can see that that gradual color is changing towards the southern part of Manitoba for 21 to 2050. And then the near future of 2051 to 2080, we're seeing quite an increase in the temperature in southern Manitoba. On average, the annual temperature is projected to increase by at least 2 degrees across the province for the period of 2021 to 2050. So this doesn't mean that the temperature is going to be higher, 2 degrees higher every day. It's an annual increase. This warming presents itself in other ways as well as more frequent and severe weather events. So what we are going to see, though, are milder, shorter, and wetter winters, hotter and drier summers, and changing in the timing of when fall starts and fall ends, and when the spring starts and the spring ends. Next slide, please. So looking a little bit more closely on the projected changes that we might see in the summer in Manitoba, we have a table here that talks about the number of very hot days. So these are the number of days that are going to be above 30 degrees. So in southern Manitoba, we're going to see an increase around 17 days in the next little while from 2021 to 2050. In northern Manitoba, we will also see an increase, but maybe only about 1 day. Heat waves. So that's the number of occurrences of 3 or more consecutive days of over 30 degrees. So we're going to see double to triple the number of heat waves in southern Manitoba in this period from 2021 to 2050. Tropical nights. Tropical nights are days in which the nighttime temperature stays at a minimum of 20 degrees. So we never, even in the midnight, don't go below 20 degrees. So we are going to see an increase in tropical nights in southern Manitoba of 1 to 5 days. And we're not going to see an increase yet, or maybe 1 day in northern Manitoba. Summer precipitation is something that we are going to see also a change in. For June, July, and August, we're going to see an increase of 1 to 2% in southern Manitoba. And in the north, we're going to see an increase of about 3% to 5%. So what does this mean? This means we're going to see drier conditions, increasing the length of the forest fire season. We're going to see an increase in the urban heat island effect in our cities. We're going to see increased energy cooling strain in our communities, the need for more air conditioning, the cooling centers if people don't have air conditioning. We're also going to see an increased risk of health risks to our at-risk populations, whether it's just from extreme heat or whether it's from health risks from smoke from wildfires. I guess on the more positive side, or an opportunity, we will see the growing zones moving north and perhaps increasing the length of the growing season for the agricultural sector in Manitoba, and also the change in species risks and availability in Manitoba. Next slide, please. The projected changes that we'll see in spring and fall in Manitoba Again, spring precipitation, so that's the total precipitation in March and April and May, we're going to see an increase of about 7 to 13%, and that's in southern Manitoba and northern Manitoba. And again, this is for 2021 to 2050. Fall precipitation, again, we're going to see an increase in both southern and northern Manitoba. The date of the last spring frost is going to occur earlier, about 7 to 10 days earlier. And the date of the first fall frost is going to occur 9 to about 14 days later. So what does this mean? This means we're going to be warmer and wetter in spring and fall. The timing of these shoulder seasons are changing, and the spring potentially starting earlier and the fall ending later. Southwestern Manitoba is expected to see a bit more precipitation, while eastern Manitoba will see less precipitation. Again, a positive, perhaps opportunity might be a longer growing season. Again, these are new patterns of precipitation. They're not necessarily going to be regulars. They're going to be very variable. And this could lead to a higher demand too on our stormwater management systems. Next slide, please. The projected changes that we're going to see in the winter are, in terms of our extreme cold days, the number of days which are below -30. We're going to see a decrease in this by about 7 days in southern Manitoba and 28 days in the north, which is very significant. Our coldest minimum temperature of the year, we're going to see an increase of about 3.5 to 4 degrees across Manitoba, south and north. Our frost days, which are our number of days with temperatures below 0, are going to see a significant decrease as well. So 19 to 20 fewer days of frost days, 17 to 18 days in the north fewer frost days. And our winter precipitations, which is our total amount of rain and snow in December, January, and February, is going to increase by 17 degrees. So in summary, what does this mean? We're seeing a degradation of our permafrost. It's going to have implications for a number of things in the north. We're going to see an increase in our freeze-thaw cycles, which will be degrading our infrastructure. We're going to see a loss of our insulating snow layer, which is going to have lasting effects for our overwintering plants. And as we're seeing already, we're going to see a shortening of our winter road season, which is going to have a severe impact on our northern communities. And again, we're going to see an increased risk of out-of-season storms. I know last January, we did have a thunderstorm in January, which is, again, very out of the norm. So we are going to continue to see these kind of unpredictable changes. Next slide, please. So how can you access and use climate information for your community? A lot of questions that you might have as you're thinking about the climate scenarios that we've discussed for the future. You're going to ask yourself, will farming in a warmer climate benefit me or add additional risk? Other questions include, I want to model future air conditioning demands for my building. And we need to upgrade our sewer system. How should climate change factor be included in our new design for our sewer system? And I need to better understand the future risks of spring flooding in my community. So these are just some examples of some questions you might be having in your community. And so we want to let you know that there are climate services that can help you with these questions. So our climate services aim to equip you as decision makers with better information to help you prepare for the variability and the changing climate. And we recognize that decision makers need this climate information to inform them and to make these decisions for the future. Next slide, please. So these are some of the climate service organizations that we in Environment and Climate Change work with, and they are a great resource. We work with ClimateWest, who of course is hosting this webinar for us. We work with the Prairie Climate Center out of the University of Winnipeg. We work with EcoWest Canada, and we work with IISD, the International Institute of Sustainable Development, as well as the federal government, Canadian Centre for Climate Services. And as you can see on this slide, we've also attached some links to the websites of information that will be useful for you to get more information on our changing climate. Prairie Climate Center hosts the Climate Atlas of Canada, which is a great resource, and I encourage you to check out that site. And the Canadian Centre for Climate Services also has a website on climate services and climate data with the links here that you can look at. Next slide, please. Some other tools and resources that we have put together in environment and climate change are a Climate Vulnerability and Risk Assessment Guide for Manitoba communities. Also, we've put together on how to use the Climate Atlas of Canada, which I just mentioned in the last slide, which is available at the Prairie Climate Center website. And we've also put together a guide on climate adaptation planning for Manitoba communities. With this guide, we've also put together a workbook to help you work through the guide, work through the needs of your community. And again, as Elaine mentioned, in our next 2 webinars, we'll be talking more about these tools and resources, how to do your vulnerability and risk assessment, and then in the 3rd webinar, how to get going on your adaptation plan and going through the workbook for your community. Next slide, please. And I think now what I'll do is I'm going to turn this back to Elaine to talk about some key takeaways that we'd really like you to take from this webinar and take to the next webinar that we'll be hosting a week today. Elaine?
Thank you, Alex. And yeah, some of the basic items that we would like you to take away from this seminar is that human activities are increasing greenhouse gas emissions. It's well within our control and in the Earth's atmosphere, and are driving those temperatures increases. Models have also demonstrated that Canada's and Manitoba's climate has changed because of global temperature increase, and it's impacting all regions and also providing opportunities for us. We have and will continue to experience increased frequency and severity of climate events until we reach net zero. The climate will stabilize once we achieve and maintain net zero global greenhouse gas emissions. We will not be reverting back to past climate conditions. At a certain point in time, there was that misconception, but we will adapt and change and build to new realities of climate. Inaction as well is more costly than taking action. The Climate Risk Institute states that for every dollar invested, you save $5 in future costs. So that's a 1 in 5 return on investment. And the numbers actually go quite higher when you look at certain areas within the 3 provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. It is important to consider climate change risks and opportunities in your decision making. Climate services are available in Manitoba and across the Prairie region and Canada to support climate smart decision making and resilient infrastructure design. Being prepared for our changing climate helps to build resilience for a safe, healthy, and prosperous Manitoba. So those are the key takeaways we'd like you to have. Next slide, please. So I'm going to tell you about our next 2 webinars that we'll be having, hosted by ClimateWest, and that's March 12th, how to conduct a vulnerability and risk assessment. We'll go through that a bit more directly. And then March 19th, we'll go through our newly released Climate Adaptation Planning Guide. Next slide. So this is the crew for climate adaptation in our Climate Preparedness and Communications branch. Sorry, we've got a new name. And we're in the Climate Action and Energy Innovation Division of Manitoba Environment and Climate Change. So at this point, I'd like to say thank you for giving us your time and also open it up for questions. And one of the 3 of us will try to provide you with an answer.